Do you want to know more about how you can eat for better health and longevity, and how your diet and lifestyle can play a part in chronic disease? Then you're in the right place. I'm Claire Day.
And I'm Daisy Lund, and we are both plant-based doctors with a passion for improving nutritional education. In this podcast, we will bring you all the latest medical evidence on how a plant-based diet can improve your health whilst being kinder to the planet and fairer to the animals that we share it with.
Twice a month, we bring you interviews from experts in the field with a focus on an important topic related to plant-based health, all while sharing recipes and food ideas.
So, welcome to, in a nutshell, the Plant-Based Health Professionals podcast. So, welcome everybody. Hi Claire, how was your week?
Yeah, it was good. I've been busy talking to both patients and other healthcare professionals this week about the benefits of plant-based eating. And having those conversations with people is really great because you actually learn what people feel are the barriers to eating more plants, only really through having these encounters and these conversations. And I really find that is what helps me to develop more effective ways of communicating about it, and actually more efficient ways, because we don't have much time in our consultation, and if we're more efficient with it, we can get more kind of impact in the next time we have a similar encounter with a patient. So this week, I think in particular, I've really enjoyed sharing the PBHP, Plant-Based Health Professionals leaflet on reflux, because it's such a common condition and we deal with it so much as GPs. And actually, rather than just sort of sending the link and saying, oh, there's this leaflet here, but actually sort of when you say to somebody, have you tried the lifestyle advice? And they always say, yeah, I've tried everything. But when you actually go through the points in the leaflet, it's really useful on reflux and things like that. You know, there's things in there, not just about diet, but about things like tight clothing. And I was having a conversation with a patient and she was wearing really tight trousers and she was coming in with a particularly bad episode of reflux. So we talked about that. And I thought, yes, I'm actually feel like I'm chipping away at people one by one. So it's been a good week.
That's brilliant. So you're getting it into the consultations, but you actually did a presentation as well. You haven't told me about that.
Oh, my presentation, yes. I had the opportunity to talk to a group of nurses all working in the locality, so not just at my GP practice, but at some of the surrounding GP practices as well. And it was, starting a conversation with them about how they can talk to patients about eating more plants. Now, of course, as soon as I started talking, asking them what they found difficult, they said, we don't really have time to talk to people about diet. But then when we went into the layers of that, it was apparent that even if they did have time, there was quite a few things that they didn't know about plant-based eating. So, I think we do need to sort of go in there and educate a bit more and then start lobbying for them to have more time. Because I think if they had more time at the moment, we might get a bit too much of the kind of cut down on pineapple if you're diabetic, low carb if you want to lose weight, and not really focusing on the fact that fibre is only in plants and we don't really need to worry too much about protein, you won't be deficient in it. So going over those points and actually finding out what they knew was really, really interesting as well.
Yeah, that is interesting because we've always talked about us as doctors not having much nutritional education. I don't know whether nurses do or not, actually.
I'm sure that when they're training, there's a lot of focus on the Eat Well guide, which, as we know, it hasn't been updated in several years. And they're definitely not aware of the messages around processed meat and red meat, in the sense of they were pretty much on message of we need to cut down on meat. But in the same way that we talk about alcohol, where we'll talk about, having alcohol in moderation, we're not actually saying to people, you should have your 14 units a week. We're not actually saying to people, you should have 2 portions of red meat a week, but you might find it written somewhere, try not to have more than 2 portions of red meat a week. And they're very, very nervous about the cost of plant-based diets. So I was very conscious when I was talking to them about, how they can actually suggest to patients how to cook a shepherd's pie more cheaply using lentils, things like that, things that to us are really very much second nature when you've been plant-based for a long time. But if you're talking about somebody about being more flexitarian, you really do need to be feeding in those recipe ideas as well.
Yeah, definitely. I think cost does tend to be something people obviously worry about and tends to be a barrier. It almost sounds like we need an episode on barriers and debunking certain myths, talking
Yes.
through those basics.
Yeah. Well, there's a great, at the beginning of this month, there was a great webinar which I caught up on the plant-based health professionals, which was exactly that. It was together with the Vegan Society and, of course, Rahina Bajekal. It was covering something like 10 myths of plant-based diets and how to debunk those.
Oh, brilliant. I missed that. I'll have to check that out.
Yeah.
So this episode today, we actually have got an expert who does know all about plant-based nutrition. I'm really excited about this particular episode. We've got plant-based health professionals member and registered dietitian, Rosie Martin. Rosie actually studied zoology before becoming an expert vegan dietitian, and she now works both in the NHS and as a freelance dietitian.
It was lovely to hear about her journey to veganism and her career path equally. And we asked her all our questions on plant-based milks, ensuring adequate calcium intake on a plant-based diet and bone health. We should mention that Rosie has also recently written a great article on plant milks, which can be found on the Plant-Based Health Professionals website. So we'll put a link in the show notes to that.
Yeah, it was a really good episode because I think, plant-based milks and the topic of dairy is still quite confusing. I remember the very limited nutritional education that I received at medical school back in the 90s. When we were taught on bone health, we were just taught calcium and calcium equals milk. And that was it. And I think, those myths still perpetuate both in mainstream education, but also in the media and advertising. And I think, very few people know any sources of calcium beyond meat and dairy.
Yeah. And it was something I had to learn. It took me a while to educate myself and learn about other sources of calcium and how you get those sources on a plant-based diet. As well as the fact that there's much more to bone health than just calcium. And here I'm talking about the vitamin D, the weight-bearing activity, the resistance training, and avoiding too much caffeine and alcohol around meal times, alcohol generally, but also not smoking and avoiding the extremes of BMI. So not being too thin or too heavy.
Yeah, I'm still learning actually about that because I read recently somewhere about salt as well, too much salt having an impact on bone health. So it's just constant learning, isn't it, really?
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's why we need that episode on bone health, but we'll get to it.
Yeah, but just sticking with milk and dairy, which was the focus of today, I think it was important to mention here about a bit more about dairy actually, because, I remember growing up as a child reading books, one in particular that I remember because it had the same name as me. It was Daisy the Cow. I remember this quite vividly because obviously we shared the same name. And the book perpetuated the myth that Daisy the cow was happily munching on grass in a huge, beautiful field, and somehow that grass was converted to milk for us. And I lived most of my adult life never really questioning that.
Yeah, and on that, I was thinking about not just what you see as a child, but I saw a film not too long ago, and it was about some kind of apocalyptic event, and a woman had survived, and she just sort of had a cow and a dog, but the cow seemed to be sort of endlessly providing her with milk. So yeah, you see that all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. And where does this milk come from, and why why is the cow being milked? I don't want to go into too much detail on this podcast, but the artificial insemination does occur under restraint, and that leads to pregnancy. And obviously, after that 9 months, the calf is born. And I just hadn't really thought about it as an adult, to be fair, until I did my own research. When the calf is born, it's quite quickly removed from the mother so that the milk that was meant for her calf is collected and sold to us as humans.
Yeah, and I think when you've sort of looked into this, you'll always be aware of the distress that causes the mother and any animal that's separated from their calf. Whether it's an elephant and calf being separated, it's the same for cows.
Yeah.
And yeah, I find it. I think we talked about this and whether it's appropriate to talk about this in a health related podcast, but it is very much about having an understanding about what the food chain is, where food comes from, whether that's where a crop is grown, how it's been transported. I think we do need to think about this process that's happening to allow humans to drink milk. And, the fact that us taking over that supply of milk means that the calf itself doesn't have that supply of milk. So they're put onto bottle milk replacement powder. And the sheer distress that's caused for those two beings, those two sentient beings, is quite overwhelming, I think. And the fact that this process needs to repeat itself over and over again. It's not the case that as long as you keep milking a cow, she'll keep producing milk. She needs to keep going into calf, and eventually she won't be able to do that anymore. She'll sort of hit the cow menopause, and then it's at that point that her life will come to an end, and she'll be slaughtered for meat. And that the lifespan of a cow, obviously through that process, is reduced a lot. They live to on average 6 years. If they were having their natural lifespan, you've got an animal that would live to 20 years.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're right. I think we do need to know where our food comes from so we can make the right choices. If cows, are milked when they're impregnated again, which is what happens, they are in this cycle, as you mentioned, there are concerns about how much estrogen and female hormones are in that cow's milk, and how hormones in dairy foods, what impact that might have on public health. Certainly we know that cow's milk is essentially a substance that's meant to grow a baby cow into a large animal. So it is quite full of fat and sugar and hormones. And sometimes, when you think about it, as a species, we are the only mammals that drink another mammal's milk into adulthood. So you sort of do need to sometimes think where our food is coming from.
And I think, there's an obvious problem here as well, is that there's not, when you impregnate a cow, it's not done with sex selection. Obviously, if it's a female calf, it may well go back into the sort of dairy industry, but the male calves are a problem. So if you are wondering what happens to the calves,
well, ultimately, I mean, if they're male calves, they're killed. So they're transported or sold for veal, or killed at a very, very young age. So, to say that the dairy industry doesn't involve cruelty or slaughter can't be further from the truth. I think it's interesting, given the vast majority of the adult population are lactose intolerant. I think it's about, 70%. It does make you wonder why we are so obsessed with dairy. And I think it's because we're taught from a very young age, as I said, that we need dairy for calcium, that we need to build strong bones. In fact, I'm from a generation, I don't know if you had this at school, Claire, where you'd get these free milk bottles.
Mm-hmm, we did.
Did you? And I think Rosie mentioned it as well when we interviewed her. I was forced to drink this milk, and I remember it being warm and I hated it. And that's when that indoctrination began, really, that misinformation. We were told that we had to drink this, otherwise we wouldn't grow properly, our bones wouldn't be strong enough.
There was a huge political outrage, I think, when Margaret Thatcher stopped it, and she, the slogan was Margaret Thatcher, milk snatcher.
Yeah, I remember that. But, there are studies showing that countries who eat the most dairy having the highest rates of osteoporosis and bone fractures. So really, I think we do need to wonder sometimes why we were fed that information. For balance, we should mention there are also studies that did find vegetarians or vegans at higher risk of bone fractures, but they didn't take into account diet quality. And that's really important, because being vegan or vegetarian doesn't automatically mean that you're healthier. We know there are quite a lot of, vegan junk foods or heavily processed vegan foods, and people, eating that sort of food may be at risk. So a lot of the data from those studies also comes from the 90s, where knowledge of what a healthy, whole food, plant-based diet should be, or what it should look like, wasn't as widely available. The knowledge just wasn't there. Plant-based milks were perhaps not fortified, and supplements like B12 and vitamin D were not as widespread.
And another message that came out was that there was some association due to low BMI, which we know is a risk factor for bone fractures. So as a plant-based eater, especially in women, you need to aim for a BMI in the middle of the normal range and avoid being underweight. Focus on your diet quality and take your vitamin B12 and vitamin D supplement. We do need to educate ourselves about where to get our calcium from plants. And there are so many great sources, which we do go into some detail of with Rosie.
Yeah, we do. Rosie mentioned some low oxalate vegetables. I had to look that one up actually after the interview. Oxalate, I found out, is an organic acid found in some plants that combine to calcium in the gut and hence reduces absorption. So spinach, for example, is quite a high oxalate green. So even though it's got calcium in it, may not be as absorbed as well as the lower oxalate green vegetables, which are high in calcium. And those are things like kale, broccoli, and bok choy. And interestingly, the bioavailability of calcium from low oxalate vegetables is still higher than that from dairy. So that was good to read. And I also found out that boiling these vegetables might actually reduce oxalate levels as well. So that will help with calcium absorption.
When I look at calcium levels in foods, it always makes me a bit scared because I've never been one for sort of obsessing about how to exactly balance my diet. I just think about it as food. So I just trust that I'm kind of doing things right. And when you read about these things and you think, well, it is possible that somebody at the extremes of the diets who's not eating middle of the range, it's good to know when you might be at risk of dropping your calcium level.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree with you. I don't obsess or look at quantities as such. I think I've done it a couple of times and then I know where the main sources are or, what I'm doing right, what I need to add a bit more of. And then, like you say, just sort of live the life. I think the one thing I did notice, though, I did look at the back of the pack of Cauldron because I was really glad that Rosie mentioned soya products being quite high in calcium, especially calcium set tofu, which I love. I love the Cauldron brand. And I tend to eat about half the packet for dinner, so half a block.
Definitely.
Do you
Yeah.
as well? Okay, good. I'm
Oh
glad
gosh.
just
Yeah.
me. But so, I mean, as we said, we're not getting obsessive about numbers, but that half a block of Cauldron tofu has got 800 milligrams of calcium, and the
Yeah.
UK dietary requirements are for 700 milligrams a day. So that's already over and beyond your daily requirement. So it's just really nice to see that and go, actually, yeah, this is something I should incorporate regularly, and I do. So I bet you're glad she mentioned tahini, aren't you?
I am. I've, one thing I've been doing this week is I've discovered the delight of maybe just having a piece of wholemeal toast, and I've still got some homemade blackberry jam left over from the summer, not too much sugar in it, and I then drizzle it with tahini because I'm a massive fan of tahini.
Yeah.
So it's good to know that I'm boosting my calcium levels.
I thought you were going to give us a savoury tahini recipe because I was going to give you a sweet one.
Oh, sorry. Savory. Yeah, well, that I pack tahini into if I make a salad or something like that. I'm a real fan of using tahini, mixing it up with various things, garlic, lemon juice, and drizzling it on a salad. I really love doing that. Or adding sesame seeds just over the top of something. You get the same slightly bitter taste, but as long as you're having it with peas or some edamame beans, it's a really
Yeah,
delicious combination.
lovely. What else did she mention? She did mention beans and legumes. I tend not to think about them as calcium sources, but it's always good to know. And I was particularly impressed with the amount of calcium in fruit. So oranges, apparently 40 milligrams in an orange.
Well, that's not bad, is it? I hadn't thought about that one.
Yeah.
And because normally I'm stuffing my orange down, thinking, oh, if I have this orange, it's got my vitamin C. I'm going to absorb all my iron from food because we've talked about that combo before.
Yeah, oranges for the win.
Yeah.
And of course, we talk about fortified foods, so plant milks, and we'll go on to more detail in the episode. Shall we go to the interview now?
Yes. And as always, before we do, can we remind listeners to please help us grow the podcast by either rating or reviewing, hitting the subscribe button and sharing it with your friends. We really appreciate this. And we've had such lovely reviews on Apple Podcasts. It's worth mentioning here. Thank you so much. It makes the world of difference to know you're listening and enjoying and that we're not just talking to each other.
Okay, welcome, Rosie. Thank you for coming on the podcast. Given you're a registered dietitian, please can you tell us a bit about your journey to being plant-based and how your work might have shaped your views on diet?
Absolutely, yeah, thank you. So I actually went plant-based and vegan prior to training as a dietitian. My background was zoology. I loved animals growing up. That's what I wanted to work with. So I worked in zoology for a little while, and then I think I was always fascinated by nutrition. I think that was probably because I had celiac disease since I was 9 months old. So I always had that knowledge that what I ate had an effect on my body. And that was always an underlying interest. And I started experimenting with veganism when I was living in Sydney and I was working in zoology. I found YouTube videos and things. And I thought, oh, I'll give this a try. And that was for health. And so I gave it a little try, but I actually stuck to it once I learned more about things like the animal welfare aspect. And I actually experienced significant health changes and benefits from going vegan. And so that's what brought me to want to study it further. And so that's when I worked really hard to change my career and actually study it properly so that I could learn more about what happened to me, but also to share that knowledge with others as well.
Brilliant. And so are you working entirely with the BDA now, or do you have many different roles?
So I have many different roles actually. So I've specialised in a few different areas in the NHS, in oncology and IBS, but I now work for NHS in occupational health. So my specialism now is really staff health and wellness. So predominantly in the main things I see are weight management and IBS. Those are kind of the two big ones that people want support with. And I use plant-based nutrition as part of that. And then I have my private practice on the side, which specialises in veganism and plant-based eating. So I'm currently focusing on supporting people with weight management, but I do a lot of general practice too. So people who maybe want to be vegan or more plant-based, but don't feel confident, or perhaps they've got a medical condition and they haven't felt supported by people they've seen, healthcare professionals they've seen maybe in the NHS or privately, or they just want to improve their health. So that's a lot of what I do. And for the BDA, my main role is as research officer for the Sustainable Diet Specialist Group. So I get involved in a lot of projects around trying to increase the awareness of diet and its impact on the world around us, particularly with dietitians in the membership as well. And then the rest of the time I do bits of kind of writing, a little bit of consulting for companies or organisations that align with my values, including Plant-Based Health Professionals UK, podcasts like this one, and then kind of blogs and then free stuff on social media to support people who want free information and to kind of myth bust and get tips and tricks for free.
Wow, amazing. That sounds like a really varied week.
It is, yeah, I do love it.
I'd be interested in asking you a bit about education for dietitians, because you mentioned that you were plant-based before you actually became a dietitian. And is there increased recognition about the benefits of a whole food plant-based diet and indeed the harms of meat, particularly processed meat, in education for dietitians? Because I see on the BDA website that meat and dairy are still listed as protein sources. Might that change in the future, do you think?
So, yeah, I would love to say that it's recognised. And I think from a processed meat and cancer point of view, I would say that it is becoming more so based on the World Cancer Research Fund recommendations. But I do believe it's not given the airtime that it needs. Absolutely not. I think a lot of the talk around it is just reducing it rather than avoiding, if they talk about it at all. If I remember rightly, when I was at university, so that was 8 years ago now, to do my postgraduate in nutrition and dietetics, there was one lecture on vegetarian and vegan diets. And that was just to help dietitians adapt their recommendations for patients who follow those dietary patterns rather than actually promoting them. So we may have mentioned some of the benefits of it, but it's not actively promoted for those reasons. I think because it was 8 years ago, I found my training quite frustrating. I think at the time I had this quiet confidence that what I had learned myself was right, but I was a novice in nutrition at the time and I was surrounded by lecturers who had been working in nutrition for a long time. So I wasn't confident with it. I kept quite a low profile in terms of veganism and I didn't have the personality to start questioning everyone. It wasn't really me. So I kind of sat back and worked through it. And unfortunately, I still don't think it's being promoted. I think we are heavily influenced by culture and by industry, and the nutrition and dietetics courses are not exempt from that. But I am hopeful of change in the future. I think the sustainability side of meat and dairy are probably the most accepted in dietetic training, but we're really only at the beginning of introducing that to student dietitians. And one thing I will say is that there are more dietitians involved in the world of plant-based eating now. when I qualified, I knew no health professionals who promoted this. So we can see it growing, but we also can't get into a false sense of security because it's not being recognised or it's not growing fast enough, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think that mirrors our experience, isn't it, with medical education, and things are changing slowly in medical schools, but not quite 100% there yet.
It's not become the norm yet, unfortunately, and that's where we need it to be, isn't it?
So, given all this expertise that you've got, we wanted to talk to you more about milk specifically, because lots of sources are describing milk as a superfood and they're urging us to go for full fat options. And some of them will be groups that people listening to this podcast will have heard of, speakers on groups like Zoe. So, what do you say if somebody asks you about the health pros and cons of a diet that includes dairy?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think the first thing to say is that when you really think about it, drinking the milk of another species is actually a very strange human behavior. So starting off in the in the context of that, but the research on dairy from a health standpoint is actually really mixed and it's filled with bias probably on both sides. So I can't sit here and tell you that if you drink a bit of dairy it will ruin your health or definitely give you cancer. But in the same breath, it's absolutely not required for human health. And it also contributes significantly to environmental breakdown and animal distress. I think the dairy industry has done an amazing job at telling people they need dairy for bone health, which is simply not true. We were influenced at a very young age with milk subsidies at schools. I remember sitting in my classroom when I was probably about 5 or 6 years old, given bottles of milk. So really it's nothing more than a marketing campaign rather than scientific fact. And it's interesting to note the Canada Food Guide has actually removed dairy from their dietary guidelines for the population. And this is partly due to their refusal to be influenced by industry, but also because dairy is just not necessary. So looking at the bigger picture, I do actively encourage people to move away from their reliance on dairy products and choose alternatives from plant sources, which will then also be lower in saturated fat, won't have the bovine hormones because dairy cows are kept pregnant whilst they're milked so that they can continue to produce milk until they're slaughtered, or growth factors that help baby cows grow into large mammals. And these growth factors may be associated with cancers like prostate cancer. And there is evidence that swapping to soya milk from dairy milk may also reduce your risk of breast cancer. And I've seen a figure up to 32% on that as well. So it's quite significant. And I think it's important to mention here that your health isn't made up of one particular food that you do either choose to include or not include. It is made up of your dietary pattern. So if your diet is really varied, high fiber, plant rich, you may not feel any immediate health impacts of consuming dairy unless you have a specific problem with it, like lactose intolerance, or perhaps it triggers acne or eczema for you, or other skin issues. But there doesn't, again, in the same breath, it doesn't appear to have any particular benefits if you have an otherwise balanced diet. But given that 70% of the global population are lactose intolerant, for many people, dairy is just not an option. And I think coming back to my zoology, we're actually the only mammals who drink milk into adulthood, let alone the milk of another species. So all other mammals lose their ability to break down lactose. They lose the enzyme lactase, which breaks it down. And therefore, for them, it's just normal that they become lactose intolerant after weaning. And it's thought that it was actually a mutation in humans, in some human populations, that meant it was beneficial for this food source to be available to us to survive. But I think looking at where we're at now in the modern world, it is something I would actively discourage.
Now, obviously, the global figures on lactose intolerance are quite scary. And we get a lot of patients coming to us saying, can I have a test? Because I think I might be lactose intolerant. I don't think there is a specific test that we can offer them, but I might be wrong there. It's certainly not in primary care. So would you recommend these patients trying a dairy exclusion diet? What would be appropriate, do you think?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So if someone is struggling with gastrointestinal symptoms, and we talk about the global population being 70% being lactose intolerant, it is lower in the UK. But if you are struggling with difficult gastrointestinal symptoms, things like diarrhea or constipation, gas, bloating, those sorts of things, Once we've ruled out anything underlying, so for example, celiac disease or inflammatory bowel disease or malignancy, then we do look to diet, and that's where I would come in. And dairy is often something we can consider because lactose is a short chain fermentable carbohydrate that can cause some gas, bloating, and changes in bowel habit for some people, particularly people who are struggling with symptoms of IBS. There are lots of intolerance tests out there on the market with fancy websites, tempting promises. But what I would say is please don't take them, keep your money, because unless you've actually got an allergy, we can't take one simple test that'll tell us if we can digest milk or not. So in that case, I would recommend removing dairy from your diet for at least 2 weeks. And it's important to look at all the aspects of your diet and where milk might pop in. And it's better if it's 4 weeks if you can, and then monitor your symptoms and see if they improve. If your symptoms do improve, then it's the re-adding of dairy back into your diet and then symptoms returning that confirms an intolerance. If, of course, you want to bring it back in, but it can be helpful just to know and confirm it. So that's what I would recommend.
Now, I know it's not your area of expertise, but I did want to know whether you could just clarify for people listening what the difference is between an intolerance of dairy and an actual allergy.
Yeah, of course. So I would say that a milk allergy is an immediate immune response to the protein in milk. So these proteins bind to specific IgE antibodies, which trigger immune defenses basically in our blood. So that would lead to symptoms quite quickly, like vomiting, diarrhea, rashes, raised bumps on the skin or swelling of the face. And symptoms in that case can range from quite mild to quite severe. A lactose intolerance is a difficulty in digesting the carbohydrate rather than the protein. And we don't, because it's a digestive thing, we don't get an immediate immune reaction because there are no antibodies specifically triggered in the blood. And therefore, that's why we can't do a simple blood test to check an intolerance, despite what the intolerance testing companies would have you believe. And I much more commonly see lactose intolerance compared to milk allergy. Milk allergy is rare in my clinic because it's much more common in infants. I believe around 2 or 3% of children under 3 have a cow's milk protein allergy. In fact, I've only seen one adult male that I can remember with it in my clinic, and he had absolutely debilitating symptoms. And it actually took a long time for us to work out what was going on because it just wasn't at the forefront of our minds.
We talked about the global prevalence of
Mm-hmm.
lactose intolerance and it being 70% and it probably being lower in the UK, whether there was any specific groups that we needed to be more suspicious of intolerance or allergy.
With that, I would say that people who have it in the family, a history of allergy, or things like celiac disease or other immune conditions, or gastrointestinal infections, those sorts of things can be at higher risk. So those are ones to more look out for, I would say.
So, Rosie, in addition to the health implications, what other impacts of dairy would you say there are in terms of the environment or animal welfare as well?
So, in terms of thinking about the environment, there are a lot of difficulties in getting that information out. I don't know what goes on behind closed doors, and it's probably purposefully kept behind closed doors, but there are huge barriers to the environmental and welfare messages that are getting out there when it comes to dairy. And in terms of one of my stories, I won't name any companies on this podcast, but I have been censored by a dairy company myself. I was commissioned to write an article for dietitians on plant-based milks and dairy, including some of the sustainability aspects. But once the article was complete, I was asked to remove the sustainability research on cow's milk compared to plant-based milk, simply because it didn't go in favour of dairy. So I pulled out because I just wasn't up for the scientific evidence that I was presenting being censored. So that's just one example of the influence of the dairy industry. And I think that it's a massive shame to see it as environment versus economy because, surely one of the most important things about the economy is to keep it viable and able to survive into the future. And so I believe a shift is beneficial for both environment and the economy. Plus, we put so many subsidies into meat and dairy as well. The UK government spends, I read, at least 1.5 billion a year subsidising livestock farming. And that's 10 times the UK's annual budget for planting trees. So distributing that money or redistributing that money is really a no-brainer. So one example is we could fund fruit and vegetables to make them cheaper for consumers and improve diets across the nation, as well as reduce our impact on the planet. And we'll always need farmers to produce our food as well. And with less meat and dairy, we'll be able to rewild so much land that we need, and we need guardians of that land as well. And in fact, a 2017 study found that 85% of the UK's total land footprint is associated with meat and dairy production, but only 48% of total protein and 32% of total calories derived from livestock products. And globally, that's 70% of land producing only 37% of protein and 18% of calories. So we can do so much better. And absolutely, dairy is one of the environmental problems because it has a much bigger impact. A lot of people talk about the environmental impact of almonds using loads of water, but when we compare it to cow's milk, it's still lower. Making that switch from dairy to almond milk is still more beneficial, and that was the information that I presented in that article. I think there will be jobs and a thriving economy without meat and dairy. It's not one or the other.
Yeah, definitely. And if people do want to make the switch to plant-based milks, can you tell us a bit about what they should be looking for in the products that they buy?
I would recommend choosing plant-based milks that firstly you like. I think that's one thing that's left off the table quite a lot. I think it can take a bit of getting used to start with because they do taste different to dairy, so give them a chance. And I'd also recommend unsweetened varieties to limit the extra sugar that people might be having. The next thing I would say is to go for plant milks that have been fortified with calcium. So it's a really easy way to keep the calcium higher in your diet because they're fortified to about the same amount. And the benefit of these is they are actually also often fortified with vitamin D and B12 and occasionally iodine as well. So I would say unless you're striving for higher protein intake, for example, if you are an athlete, an older adult, if you're unwell or you're struggling to eat, then we don't actually need to get protein from our milk. The higher protein milks are soya and pea milk at around 3 grams per 100 mils. But if you're consuming a varied plant-based diet, then milk isn't required as an extra for protein. Actually, very little of the population's protein comes from dairy milk. The majority comes from our food. And as we all know, all proteins contain all the essential amino acids that humans need to make proteins as well. I think if you go organic, then they can't actually add much to it. So they likely won't be fortified. But if you prefer these, I would recommend ensuring that you have alternative calcium sources like calcium tofu, dark leafy greens. And the other nutrient that we want to think about is iodine. So dairy milk is a source of iodine, but this is only because iodine is added to cattle feed. In fact, the more a cow grazes on grass, the lower the iodine content of their milk. So if you're concerned about things being natural, in inverted commas, then iodine in milk, in dairy milk, is no more natural than if we were to supplement ourselves directly, which is what I would recommend.
When we think about the idea of a whole food plant-based diet and trying to have things that aren't processed, what about the thickeners and emulsifiers that you find in plant milk? Is there any good way of reading the ingredients list for that one?
Yeah, that's a great question, a really big topic at the moment as well. We're learning more about ultra processed foods and the impact they're having on our body and also our brain. But it is my position and the position of the BDA as well that the amount of processing is not always directly related to the healthfulness of food. So, yes, if your food is a concoction of processed ingredients with high levels of fat, sugar, and compounds, maybe you don't recognize, then it's unlikely to promote health. However, many of our foods do go through processing so that we can consume them and they can be beneficial in that way. For example, canning, cooking, mashing, fermenting, and it doesn't mean that they're harmful either. So we need to look at the nutritional profile of the final product and look at what it adds to our diet. In the case of plant-based milks, many of them are predominantly water mixed with a bean, nut, or grain of some kind. Some beneficial nutritional elements are often added, like, as I mentioned, calcium, vitamin D, and then often there are only small amounts of things like oil, thickeners, or emulsifiers that help them become more palatable for our tastes. So unless you go organic, in which case you can find some very simple ones, which are just the water and the bean or nut. I think it's a mistake to go down the route of natural always being the better option. There are many natural things that are not good for us, like poisonous berries or mushrooms, and many unnatural things that provide benefits, like supplements for someone with a deficiency. In the case of emulsifiers, there has been some research to say that they could impact our microbiome, our gut microbiome, so all the bacteria that live in our gut negatively and potentially cause some inflammation. I can understand if someone chooses to avoid them based on their own preference, perhaps if they have a gut condition or if they are more at risk of a gut condition like IBD. I don't personally ask people to remove them yet until we've got more evidence, because this is often one of the easiest ways to meet their calcium needs, and long-term bone health is so important to consider at all ages. And I think if you're including plant milks as part of a whole food plant-based diet, you're already going to have a lot lower additions of additives and emulsifiers and all of those things where we get a lot of them from in our diet.
Yeah, that's true. I would agree with that. We were talking about calcium and the worry that people have on a vegan diet about meeting their calcium requirements. Although some of the plant-based milks, as you say, have calcium added, and we make this assumption that people will make a switch from, say, consuming the 3 glasses of dairy milk a day to 3 glasses of a fortified milk. If you're not doing that, can you just highlight again what foods we should be looking at and how to get to what the recommended daily amount is for calcium, just with some examples?
So calcium is a big one when it comes to dairy. A lot of people do worry about that, and we have touched on it. So as you say, switching to a fortified plant milk will give you pretty much the same amount of calcium, about 120 milligrams per 100 mils, with a really similar digestibility as well. To top up, I would say you could include things like calcium set tofu. So this is probably one of the highest levels of calcium that I found in any single serving of something. So if you look at your tofu and it says calcium anywhere in the ingredients list, it's going to give you quite a good dose of calcium. But also plant-based foods like dark leafy greens, low oxalate ones like kale, broccoli, watercress, Brussels sprouts, oranges, almonds, and sesame seeds as well. A healthy adult in the UK is recommended to get 700 milligrams of calcium per day. So to reach your 700 milligram, you probably need to have maybe 200 mils of fortified plant milk in the morning in your porridge or smoothie, maybe 100 grams of tofu, and then 70 grams of kale with your lunch or dinner. If you fall into any of the at-risk groups, like I do with celiac disease, or if you're postmenopausal or breastfeeding, for example, then requirements can go up quite significantly. So in this case, thinking about adding extra glasses of milk, perhaps turn it into a hot chocolate or a latte, or pile up some more leafy greens, or you can bring in things like tempeh, beans or chickpeas into your diet as well to give you that extra calcium.
Those are great examples. I was just going to say, Claire, because you love tahini, don't you?
Oh, I do. Yeah. Daisy brought me some very special tahini,
Oh,
actually, as a
nice.
gift, small
Oh,
gift.
Because
lovely.
that's like
Yeah.
just all crushed sesame seeds, isn't it? And is
Yeah,
that
it's
quite
pretty
high in
much,
calcium?
yeah, it's like peanut butter, but made with sesame seeds. And my local supermarket actually haven't had it for weeks. And so I was on holiday last week, up in the north of the county, and I went to a supermarket there and they had it. So I stocked up on about 3 or 4 jars of it because, yeah, I love it too.
I mean, tahini, is that something I keep wondering, is that something I could be blending my own with a big pack of sesame seeds? You know, like
Possibly.
when you make cashew butter and
Yeah.
you literally just
Yeah.
grind them up and it sort of turns into a butter. I
Yeah.
wondered whether I had the right sort of, within my spice blender or something, I could actually start knocking out the tahini.
You could
Uh,
absolutely try and let me know how it goes, because that would be really interesting. If you've got a good blender, I don't see why not.
I'll send you a jar.
Yes, please.
Right. Sticking with bone health, what other things do you advise with regards to improving bone density and protecting against fractures? Looking at people at different ages and what they should be doing.
So you're right, it's not all about calcium. We need many other nutrients in our diet for bone health. For example, vitamin D helps us to absorb our calcium, but then also things like vitamin K, magnesium, protein is also important. And these are all very accessible if we follow a balanced and varied diet. One of the key parts of bone health is actually strength exercise as well. Up until about 1 or 2 years ago, I never picked up a weight. I ran and I did yoga, but I was never very strong. And I actually fall into an at-risk group when it comes to osteoporosis because I'm a small female vegan with celiac disease. So I actually started climbing a couple of years ago, and I can't believe the progression I've made. I categorize myself as someone who just didn't do strength exercise, but the strength that I've built is predominantly fueled by my desire to keep my bones healthy as I get older. So our bones are building up and breaking down constantly. And from the tender age of just 30, when we reach our peak bone mass, which I passed a few years ago, we actually lose more bone than we build. So it's important for everyone. So if you're younger, you want to be aiming for a higher peak bone mass. And if you're older, you want to be helping yourself to maintain the bone mass that you have. And so putting load onto our muscles, which puts loads onto our bones, helps them to adapt and remodel and strengthen because they adapt to pressure. So if they've got more load, they will become stronger. What I would say here, I'm not obviously a physio, so I'd say definitely start small to avoid injury and build up your weights, and you will do your bone health and your health later in life a world of good. I've seen a message on Instagram recently saying instead of building your beach body, lift weights for your old lady body, and I just love that. I'm working towards my old lady body. So in addition, we want to minimize behaviors that negatively impact bone health as well. So things like smoking, alcohol, and diets that are poor and based on processed foods and high salt foods as well.
Excellent. You did your strength exercises today already, haven't you, Claire?
Oh, of a fashion, yeah. I think,
Brilliant.
I hate having loads of weights lying around. So at the moment, I'm kind of stuck with just these 1.4 kilogram weights in each hand. And I know I've probably got to a point where I could go a little bit higher.
Oh,
But
definitely.
Great.
yeah.
Amazing. Yeah, it's that progressive overload, isn't it, that you want? Brilliant.
Excellent.
Yeah, fantastic.
Yeah, I would say to patients, if you're exercising too much and you're doing too many bench presses, are you literally creating these chronic tears of muscles? But then I was reading that you actually want to break down the muscle cells and use more protein to actually build them up as you're going.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
it's that breakdown that triggers that building of muscle fiber.
Yeah,
Yeah.
brilliant. Rosie, it's been really fascinating. I hope that this has given people the confidence to try plant-based milks and to give dairy a bit of a break from their diet, and hopefully with the view to eliminating it completely. So thank you very much for your expertise on this. Before we let you go, though, we would love to hear a little bit about what a plant-based dietitian eats for dinner. So could you give us an idea of what you're having tonight?
Yeah, so tonight is a bit of an unusual night actually because it's a work meal. So it's going to be a little bit different. And I don't actually eat out that often because it can be a bit tricky with being vegan and being gluten free. I don't not eat out, I definitely do. And when I was on holiday last week, I took the opportunity to do that. So tonight they have sent me the menu. I've got a sweet potato and red pepper hummus to start. Hopefully they'll give me something to dip in that. And then they've got a Mexican bowl for my main. So I think that's black bean and sweet corn salsa, edamame guacamole, sweet potato with pomegranate molasses, spicy rice, rocket, and chipotle tomato salsa. So it's a bit unusual. But I would say normally I'm not actually the best at preparing proper big meals. I do batch cook maybe once a week. For example, I've got into the habit of really regularly going for a Buddha bowl where you can just choose a whole grain, choose the veggies that you've got, choose which protein you fancy, and then pop them together with a delicious sauce. So I often go for something like a tofu or tempeh with a tamari and maple syrup sauce, and then brown rice and a selection of veggies that I've got in the fridge that week. And I love it. So it's all good.
I love that too, because I think it's really highlighting that eating plant-based is simple. You don't have to make it complicated. It doesn't have to be a fancy recipe.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think when I first went plant based, I did follow a lot of recipes and kind of learn how to put things together and have a bit of a learning curve with it. I think once you start to remove the idea that you need the meat or the cheese or whatever in there. And then once you get into that mindset, it becomes really easy to throw things together and to know the different proportions of your plate that you want to fill with certain foods. So yeah, once you've got a little bit of knowledge, it becomes a very easy way to live and a lifestyle to take on.
Yeah, I agree. What about you, Claire? You always have fancy recipes.
Well, I'm thinking as you're talking about the confidence in throwing things together, because I'm probably going to start by making a bolognese sauce. And I'm either going to use that with some whole wheat spaghetti, or I might actually make a lasagna, because for me, it's the same
Ooh.
kind of base.
Mm.
But I will do a mix of the chopped carrot, the celery, the chopped onion to do that soffritto, as they say in Italian, or mirepoix
Mm.
for our French
Lovely.
listeners.
Yeah.
Um, and then you add to that a bit of red wine. All the alcohol will be gone through the cooking process. and usually some vegan Worcester sauce, some passata, and then you pick your protein. And I think tempeh is having a moment with us, isn't it? So I might actually shred up some tempeh and put that in. But sometimes I might use a can of lentils or just some regular textured vegetable protein. And as I say, if I get as far as making the lasagna, I'll do a cashew bechamel sauce, sometimes a layer of spinach in there as well. And yeah,
That sounds
really
good.
nice.
That sounds amazing. I wish I was coming to your house.
It's a bit of a trek.
That
But it's
sounds
interesting what you said about using whatever protein source you want, because actually in a ragu sauce, you can sort of modify that. So Deliciously Ella's got a recipe where she just uses chickpeas. I'd have never thought to make a bolognese with chickpeas, but it works really well.
Yeah, exactly. It's about thinking outside the box, isn't it? And actually just thinking, okay, what high protein plants can I add in here? And there's a good variety of them that you can choose from and choose your favorites. And this is probably why I don't do as much preparation, is because I love getting to the end of the day and just thinking, what do I feel like? What do I really want? And often it's, might be some tempeh. I might really feel like tofu instead, or a pile of beans with the bowl. It's a really nice kind of freedom and flexibility to think about what you want.
Daisy, what are you doing for dinner?
Well, my recipes have to please a teenager, so they're often a little bit more family friendly. But yeah, I am doing one of his favorites actually, which are tofu fajita wraps. So we used to do a lot of chicken fajitas when we were eating animals, and we've now changed basically all our chicken recipes are now tofu, which works really well. So I'll cut some tofu into strips and I'll just marinate it before in some paprika, chili, garlic powder, salt and pepper, and then I coat it with corn flour and pop it in the air fryer as I put everything in my air fryer. And they come out really good, and we'll have that with guacamole or salsa and veggies on the side, lots of coriander, lemon juice, and just, we can just wrap it up as we go along as we're eating.
Amazing.
Yeah.
You're giving me lots of ideas. I love this.
Yeah, that's what we like about the podcast, sharing recipe ideas.
Brilliant. Brilliant.
So I think we're going to wrap things up there. Thanks so much for talking to us about the milk issue. I'm sure there are other things we want to talk to you about, Rosie, but if you're good to us, you will come back on.
I will, absolutely, yeah.
Thank you,
I
Rosie.
love talking about all this stuff, so absolutely.
That's great. Thank you so much.
Thank
No
you.
worries.